Good afternoon and welcome to the 6th annual Defending the Early Years Summer Institute. My name is Denisha Jones and I currently serve as the Executive Director for Defending the Early Years and your Summer Institute moderator. The annual Defending the Early Years Summer Institute brings together early childhood educators, advocates, and researchers from across the country to develop a thoughtful and dynamic grassroots advocacy platform and action steps that support the whole child, respect child development, and recognize the importance of play so that all children may experience a just, equitable, and quality early childhood education and future. This year's theme is Advancing Quality in Defense of Early Childhood Education and Care. And now I would like to introduce our DEY co-founder and president of the board, Nancy Carlson-Page, to offer opening remarks. Hi, Nancy.
Hi, Denisha. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is going to be a wonderful institute, and I'm really happy that we're focusing on the issue of quality and advancing quality. You know, when we started defending the early years, now more than 10 years ago, it was really around this issue. We were alarmed when we first saw how the education reform movement that was so driven by data and standardized tests and standards was starting to push down into early childhood, starting to focus on academic skills and teacher-directed learning to a greater extent. We were seeing less play, less child choice, less arts, and less music, and it really, and especially in low-income communities, because the kids who have preschools where they're paying tuition often have a richer program and aren't as affected. So we brought together national leaders from around the country to start defending the early years with an agenda to advocate actually for high quality early childhood education, which has been a challenge because a lot of times people don't want to talk about quality. They have other issues to focus on, but we feel like, you know, we really don't want to lose what is the best of what we know from our field of what's quality early childhood education as the field changes, which it's definitely doing. A lot has happened since the time we started. We saw Race to the Top that really did push further the data-driven, academic, skill-driven early childhood education, unfortunately. And then we saw the beginning of online pre-K and the spread of online pre-K programs. And then, of course, we had a pandemic that influenced children and families in so many ways. But two primary ways is children had less social interaction during that period, and they also spent a whole lot more time on screens. And I just saw a report come out, a survey from Education Week that just came out, where 1,500 teachers responded, many of them early childhood teachers, all saying the same thing, that young kids have fewer social skills, unfortunately, less sharing, less ability to cooperate, less ability to listen, diminished fine motor skills. This is compared to pre-K and young kids from 5 years previously. Difficulty tying shoes and cutting and holding a pen. And I think these things very much relate to the changes, all of these changes, but definitely a lot more time passively engaged with screens. So at the same time that these influences that I perceive as often negative, we have increased access to early childhood education and some very exciting things happening around the country. There's much more talk of universal pre-K than I've ever heard before, but the issue of quality doesn't get discussed a lot. And that was a big reason why we wanted to have this institute this week focus on quality and how does it fit in to the changing times that we're in right now. We see pre-Ks getting absorbed into public schools. I'm glad that Dale Farran is with us. She's going to talk to us about that issue. It's very related to quality, and quality is still for us a central issue that we want to consider in these 3 days. We have a fantastic lineup of speakers, and it's going to enrich our understanding and deepen our understanding of quality, early childhood education, and how we can maintain it and advocate for it in the context of the changing field that we're seeing now. So we can, yes, so we
Thank
can
you
go,
so
yeah.
much, Nancy. That was great opening remarks. So good. And you're going to stay and co-moderate today with me, and you'll also co-moderate day 3. So
Yeah.
we love to be able to hear from you. Thanks to everyone in the chat who's introducing themselves. Please feel free to tell us who you are, your name, where you're from, and engage with each other. We'll also be sharing resources in the chat. So Nancy gave us a little overview of the issue of quality, but I just wanted to remind you that our mission at Defending the Early Years is to work for a just, equitable, and quality early childhood education and care for every young child. And as Nancy said, quality has always been an important component in ensuring that all young children have access to early care and education. Nonetheless, defining, measuring, and guaranteeing high quality demonstrates the complexities and difficulty in making high quality for all a reality. What does quality mean to you? How do you demonstrate quality in your program or classroom? How can the systems used to measure quality be improved? What does high quality mean in relation to justice and equity for disadvantaged and marginalized children? This year, the 6th annual Defending the Early Years Summer Institute will address these questions and many more. So today we launched the Institute with an overview of today's quality landscape. Tomorrow we dive into the work of advancing quality in policy and practice with 3 Bank Street Early Childhood Policy Fellows. And on Wednesday, we conclude with a research in the practice session that examines threats to quality and again, the need to center equity in our work. Though we recognize that 2 hours will only give us enough time to scratch the surface each day, we hope these conversations will inspire you to continue working for a just and equitable childhood for all children. Now for some logistics. We are recording the Institute each day and will send out copies of the recordings to everyone who registered. We are also live streaming on our Facebook page. If you would like a certificate of attendance, please complete the form that will be emailed to you tomorrow morning and also on Wednesday. And this year, we are excited to offer our first Summer Institute Reflective Workbook. We know how important it is for early childhood practitioners and advocates to reflect on their work. And as we prepare to launch our DEY Professional Learning Institute Reflective Practice Series, we wanted to begin by offering this free reflective workbook. You should have received an email today. You'll also receive a copy of it tomorrow. And we'll put links in the chat as well too to access it. In addition to the 6-hour certificate of attendance, if you fill out the workbook and send it to us, you can earn an additional 3 hours. At the end, there will be time for Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Please do not submit questions for the chat, for the Q&A in the chat, as we have to go through and hunt for them. It's so much easier if you just place them in the Q&A, and I will send out timely reminders during our conversation. We do encourage you to dialogue with each other in the chat, but please put your questions for the panelists and the moderators into the Q&A. We are also collecting all of the resources that will be shared in the chat, and we'll send you a link to the resources in our email tomorrow as well. Now, I would like to introduce our day 1 panelists. Amy O'Leary is the Executive Director of Strategies for Children, an advocacy and policy organization that works to ensure that Massachusetts invests the resources needed for all children from birth to age 5 to access high-quality early kids education and care programs. You can read more about Amy in the chat, and also we'll put a link to her organization as well. Welcome, Amy. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Thanks. Dale Clark Farran is an Emerita professor at Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. Her recent research emphasizes on evaluating the effectiveness of alternative preschool curricula. Currently, she's directing an evaluation of the state of Tennessee's pre-kindergarten program. She's a member of the DREAM Network, identifying early childhood classroom math practices that are most positive for children's development. She's also recently became a DEY National Advisor, and she's been a guest with DEY before. Welcome, Dale. We're so glad to have you back.
Oh, you're my favorite organization.
Thank you. And a first timer, we have Dr. Darielle Blevins, is an assistant research professor with the Children's Equity Project. Dr. Blevins' work centers on the need for love, equity, and justice to ensure quality learning spaces in early childhood and beyond. She acts as a context expert where she supports state leaders, practitioners, and programs to embed equity into policy and practice for several national centers and organizations. We are delighted to have you join us for your inaugural, but we hope won't be your last, DEY Summer Institute.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. So we put more details of our 3 panelists in the chat. We're also putting links to their organizations where you can find out more about them. But I'm going to turn it over to Nancy, who's going to get started with our first question for Amy O'Leary.
I'm very excited to be having this experience with this amazing, impressive group of people. So welcome to you. So Amy, let's start with you. Given your extensive legislative work, your extensive experience in legislative work and your extensive experience in early childhood, because I've followed you for a long time, but you've tried to expand access to early childhood care and education in Massachusetts. So can you share with us the role of high quality and what it plays in policy advocates' work?
Sure. Thanks so much for the question, Nancy. And I have been following you for a long time. Fun fact, when I was a preschool teacher at Ellis Early Learning in the South End, I went to a workshop that you gave around free play in Cambridge. And, you know, as an educator, as a director, as someone who cares about early childhood, thinking about child development and play and what that looks like in classrooms and family childcare homes is so critical. And then I've learned a lot about what that looks like to translate that when you think about making policy, whether it's through bills in your legislature, whether it's through the budget. And we're having right now in Massachusetts a budget debate that includes a lot of policy. So I think over my career, I've been very interested in that intersection of if we know what's good for young children and families, and if we also think about how educators are working in settings across, you know, many different communities, what does that quality benchmark look like? And just as we get started, I also know that we saw a lot of 9:30 callers here today, so it's great to see you. And I'll talk more about the 9:30 call, but that has been a way that we have changed the way that we do everything at Strategies for Children. And it's really about leading with the expertise and the lived experience of people who are doing this work every single day. And I think anytime we think about policy, that's really got to be critical. And I think oftentimes we have focus groups or we have public hearings, but really when you think about writing the language that's either going to be turned into a regulation or is in a law, you really want to be thoughtful about what that language says, how it can be interpreted, and what that looks like in practice. So I think one thing that the 9:30 call started during the pandemic. On, you know, the 3rd week of March, we had our first call, and it started out small with about 20 people who had kind of advocated together throughout, you know, the last 2 decades. And it really was about getting on the same page, getting accurate information, because we know that often misinformation, especially when it comes to policy, can be detrimental. We spend a lot of time trying to get accurate information instead of thinking about what the implications of that policy might be. So the 9:30 call is going 4 years strong, and it's been a daily check-in on Zoom for 30 minutes. We did it 5 days a week during the pandemic. Recently, we've gone back down to 4 days a week. But one of the most beautiful parts of the 9:30 call is the community that's been created across Massachusetts. But again, weighing in every day, the people who are doing the work. During COVID, we were making real-time policy decisions. The commissioner at the time was coming on saying, we're going to make these changes to the rules. People who were running programs said, that's not going to work. And let me tell you why. And that kind of give and take is really hard to get kind of in real-time policy making. Part of it is the process can seem intimidated. You know, you can be intimidated when you think about who makes the laws. Have they ever met a child before? Have they ever tried to be in a classroom? And I think anytime we've done our work at Strategies for Children, we've always thought about quality as something that should be defined in a way that's broad and flexible enough to appreciate and accommodate the settings where we know young children are, and gives enough information to folks that as they're trying to run programs, as they're trying to think about how they're doing right by children, there's some rubrics to follow. One thing about, you know, Nancy, you talked about some of the things that we're hearing from people who are doing this work every day about mental health services. for both educators and for the young children that they're seeing every day. Behavioral challenges, burnout. We have program directors who have been doing this work, who are now in their 50s and 60s, and they are tired. And so some days you can wonder, how am I really going to think about quality when I'm just trying to get through the day? One interesting thing that we've heard on the 9:30 call is almost this wish of talking about quality. In Massachusetts, the structure around quality has been our quality rating and improvement system. And right now that is on pause. And I'm sure we could have a whole summer institute about the challenges of a quality rating and improvement system. But what I think, recently on the call, somebody said, like, I kind of miss it. And I think it was really about the proxy of, I want to be doing the right thing. I want to be using child development information. I want to run a high quality program. I need some guidelines, some help and support about what that might look like. This morning on the 9:30 call, we heard from Deb Fliss from Connecticut, and she talked about their quality improvement system, which is not a rating system, that is very inclusive and is really about support. So I think as we think about, any kind of policy or legislation, getting the people who do the work every day as part of those conversations, and then thinking about what belongs in statute, what belongs in a law, what should be in regulation, and how is it responding to how we know that young children learn best through play.
Wow, did you finish?
I think so. I think
for the moment, but that's a really profound answer, because it just makes me think of so many things. One of them, just out of the gate, is it's hard to talk about what quality is when we're going outside of the field. When you're talking to legislators, when you're talking to people on the street who don't have an early childhood background, even if you use the word play, it's misinterpreted, it's confused. People think kids aren't learning. You have to do so much explaining. I'm working in Massachusetts as well around the science of reading issues that we'll talk more about on Wednesday. But I know that because there's legislation related to it also going on. And right. I know that one of the challenges that people are telling me, the educators, that they try to explain to legislators what good literacy education looks like, which is part of quality. And it's very confusing for the listener. It's
right.
hard. Yeah. So I think that's one of
I could just pick up on that part, the language that we use, how we talk about all the work that we do. What I found, and I should have said this, in Massachusetts, we are fortunate to have a governor, a House, and a Senate, and our leadership that are paying attention to these issues. When you think about funding levels alone, we have over $1.5 billion right now in our Department of Early Education and Care. And I think, so I want to acknowledge that. I also think that during the pandemic, elected and appointed officials became much more versed and knowledgeable about some of the things that we have struggled to explain in the past. I think the financing systems, people understand a lot easier now. I think what does parent choice actually look like? Is it a family child care program? What do families really want, and how do they choose where they want their young children to be? I think that really came to light during the pandemic. And I think how central, whatever you want to call it, if it's childcare, early education, how central it is not just to our economy, but when we're thinking about the future of children who are now, we're experiencing early ed during pandemic, but now, continue on to the next levels of learning. This whole idea of investing earlier, for better outcomes, no matter what the setting is, I think that really, people are able to understand that in a different way. But I think you're right. Sometimes we can be our own worst enemy when we're trying to explain things or make progress. We can sometimes get so hung up on the details, and we're sometimes not even explaining the big picture of what we're trying to get done.
That's so interesting, because we've struggled with this as a DEY staff in conversation quite a bit, which is, how do we find the language that's, even for the practitioners, as you're acknowledging, teachers are asking, they want guidelines for quality, because it isn't data, which is what it became for a long period of time, and it's still used as a main measure by many legislators. But how do you distill what quality means for early childhood education? It's still something that we're very much struggling with. I'm actually hoping through these 3 days that we get some more insight and a better grasp maybe on how to elucidate what those key issues are that would be things that teachers as well as people who aren't teachers would be able to grab hold of and understand.
I think that's right. I also think this idea, and we went through this kind of as thinking about quality. Do you really support programs who are already reaching what they might define as quality, or do you put more increased investment in programs that need help? And again, I think that's one of those debates that just have been a circular conversation instead of we should help all programs get to where they want, because we know that children are in all these different settings. And again, we get sometimes hung up on delivery systems and words that we're using instead of really taking a step back and thinking about it and appreciating how hard these jobs are, how hard it is to plan for, you're making judgment every 10 seconds when you're monitoring classrooms. Some people say it's not brain surgery. It is brain surgery. It is rocket science to really be able to be that well, that confident as an educator that you can kind of look around this kind of multi-developmental learning, atmosphere and be able to customize the education. We recently had a conversation with the Rennie Center in Massachusetts, and they came on the 9:30 call to say, what do you do in early childhood that you don't even think about customization and supporting young children that K-12 can learn from? And it was such an interesting and compelling conversation because it really gave folks in the birth to 5 space the opportunity to think, to name, to acknowledge the things that they're doing every day without maybe thinking twice about it, and then really try to kind of push up this developmental way of thinking about supporting children.
That's really helpful, Amy. Thank you so much. So, okay, I hope, you'll participate in the discussion as we go on today. I'm sure people want to know more about a lot of things you're saying as we all interact, and certainly to learn more about the 9:30 call, because while we know about it in Massachusetts, it could be something that other states want to try to implement. And it's like a concrete thing that has opened a lot of doors, we can tell from what you've said so far.
I will add the link. We just had a case study written about it. So I'll add that link so folks, and please, I'll put my email in chat. Folks can follow up with me.
That's fantastic. Thanks.
Yeah, please share. I was fortunate to be a guest on the 9:30 call when we launched our working groups, and we have a Massachusetts working group, which has been great. And so it is a really great opportunity, and I'm so glad you shared that. And I think one of the issues too that I hope we talk about is the need for flexibility around quality. We know intuitively what high quality is, but we also need to be flexible that it looks different in different spaces because it's meeting the needs of different children. And so we so much want to standardize quality, but then we can't standardize children, so we can't standardize quality, right? And so I just want to keep that in our minds as we keep going. But we are right on time, and so we are going to head to our next question with Dale to talk a little bit about the research, which is super important. And it was just timely that this morning, Dale, we published your blog about the challenges of maintaining high quality early childhood spaces in public schools as we push forward in this expansion of preschool, which we know is happening in many states, which many of us want, but there are concerns around the quality. Can you share a bit more about your research and the issues surrounding preschool expansion and quality in particular?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. This is a complex issue, and you are right. In the last 10 or 15 years, states have rushed to implement statewide pre-Ks or citywide pre-Ks, like as in New York, universal pre-K, and then recently in California, they're calling it TK, but it's really pre-K by any other name. And they just put something like $2.7 billion into expanding and creating this TK program. They typically serve 4-year-olds. Some of them serve 3 to 4-year-olds. But I've been doing this research in those kinds of classrooms for 30 years now. And so one of there are several things people often say to me. So, what should parents care about when they look at these classrooms? And one of the things that we have to realize is that when you push the expansion of pre-K or TK into the public schools, and 95% of the classrooms that I visited and taken data in have been in public elementary schools. You're often pushing them into buildings that were never set up to house young children. They might not even be set up very well for kindergarten children, but they're not set up well at all for pre-K children, for 4-year-olds. And so we examined almost 100 classrooms that were in 2 urban settings, and all these classrooms were in the public schools. Some of them didn't have bathrooms attached to the classroom. Some of them, about a third of them, had bathrooms attached to the classrooms, but the teachers didn't use them. And I can only assume it's because they perceived it to be beneath them, because 4-year-olds have accidents, right? So it was better to take the class down the hall or over 2 halls and have them wait outside and wait for 2 or 3 children to go in at a time and then come back out. And then they have to wait at the end of the line until everybody's had a chance to go to the bathroom. So we have that happening so 2/3 of the classrooms used bathrooms in the big building. And, but 88% of the classrooms went to lunch in the cafeteria. And I've been in those cafeterias. I don't want to insult anybody who's a lunch lady who's on the call, but I've been there where they ask the children at 8:30 in the morning to say, do you want a hot dog or do you want barbecue? And they have to say, and then they get to the lunch at 11 or 11:30, and the lunch lady says, what did you say? Lunch? Did you want a hot dog or do you want barbecue? And the kids say, and then they pick whatever looks the best. And then everybody gets upset because that's not what they, anyway. So it's the cognitive demands on kids to go through the hallway and to be quiet so they don't disturb the 4th graders. So you hear these admonitions all the time, walk, don't skip, don't hop, don't run, don't touch your neighbor, don't touch the wall, put a bubble in your mouth, stop at the crosswalk. I mean, what we saw was for these classrooms, the amount of time that these kids were in transitions was 2 hours a day. So 2 hours of a 6.5-hour day, they were actually transitioning. So, and we call that a time when, yes, there might have been opportunities for learning, but they weren't used that way. So kids were not involved. They were and what happens, the more transition time you have, the more behavior disapproval you have, the more admonitions, the more control teachers have to exert over children's behavior. And once they're out into the main public school, they have to really be careful about, adhering to the rules of the school, the big school. Many of these classrooms don't have appropriate playgrounds, and for whatever reason, teachers don't take them outside. So we were in classrooms that met for 7 hours a day, and half those classrooms never went outside or to an indoor gym. I think that these issues are extraordinarily debilitating for both children and the teachers who have to be in those rooms with those kids. Imagine your own 4-year-old, if you have children, trying to keep that 4-year-old quiet, crisscross applesauce, sit down, be quiet for 7 hours a day. They don't have the facilities that would help young children develop or even accommodate them and care for them. So but the truth of the matter is, when you look at these programs, they can be high quality, and they tend to be better programs where you might like to put your grandchild or your own child if they're in higher income areas. So schools that are serving higher income families do tend to have a door from the classroom that goes to the outside, and the outside has a very nice, child level, 4-year-old level playground, and you could actually take, your finger paints outside when the weather's nice, and you can have sort of in and out of the play of the classroom, so it's easy access back and forth. They have nice facilities, and they tend to have a bathroom that's connected, and they have lunch served to the children in the classrooms, right? When universal pre-K started in New York City, I was talking to, I interacted with the people who were setting that up, and they were highly aware of these facility effects on children and tried to set up rules like I think in New York, they tried to set up a rule that you had to serve lunch in the classroom. They wanted to set up rules that you had to have an adjoining bathroom, but they didn't have enough facility. They didn't have enough public schools that would make that possible. And they didn't have enough public schools that would make an appropriate class outdoor environment accessible to children. Sometimes the children had to walk across the street to get to a park. And they knew that was an issue. But the work that's come out of New York shows that in areas of the city where you were serving higher income families, they were significantly higher quality programs than in areas of the city that were serving lower income. So now with with trying to do universal pre-K, we're actually accentuating inequities. We're starting poorer children from poorer families off in less facilitative environments. And it really upsets me. And Amy can talk about this, our state policymakers just tend to think pre-K, and they think back and they think it's the Abecedarian program. The Abecedarian program, which I worked for back in the 70s, the Abecedarian program cost about $40,000 a year per child. We're not even doing the Abecedarian. We're not doing anything like those kinds of programs, but those are the programs I think legislators have in their mind when they just implement, pre-K, without realizing that we have not defined what makes a good pre-K program within a public school. What are the qualities that are really essential? What are the interactions and behaviors that are essential to have that would facilitate young children's development? You probably know that we studied the statewide pre-K. 93% of the classrooms that we studied were in the public schools. If you just look at getting ready for kindergarten, they looked great. And when we published those findings, this was a randomized controlled trial. This is like a medical study, like aspirins or no aspirins. And we randomly assigned from waiting lists those children who got into the pre-K compared to those children who didn't get in. And we've been following them now through high school. So when we followed them into the beginning of kindergarten, they looked great because all those concrete school readiness skills, those kids who had been in pre-K attained them earlier than the kids who'd been in the comparison group. And the comparison group either stayed home, most of them stayed home, or they attended a mom and pop sort of pre-K childcare program in their neighborhood. So, but then what we saw is by the second grade, by first grade, the kids who'd been in the comparison group caught right up to the pre-K kids. By third grade, the pre-K attenders started not looking so good. Their achievement scores started going down. More alarming was by sixth grade, the children who had been in pre-K were expelled or suspended more often than the children who had been in the comparison group. Now, remember, these are not just apples to apples. These are Macintosh apples to Macintosh apples that we're comparing. These kids their families all wanted to go to pre-K. They got in by a lottery draw. So the groups are equivalent, but their experiences post the pre-K years were not equivalent. And I think a part of it is we're starting young children in these classrooms. We're starting to do rigid schooling so early that it makes kids almost allergic to school when they get into those upper grades. And what they were suspended and expelled for were school violation rules, wearing your cap backwards, not tucking your shirt in, speaking badly to it, sassing a principal, those kinds of things. I think they were just, it was not helpful to be in a very school-like environment when they were so young. Should I stop there? You want me to go? I can go
No, that's
on.
that is great because you're giving so much great information. I love it. So we just put a link in the chat to the original study Dale's talking about from her work in Tennessee, the effects of statewide preschool. It's there. We also linked to the blog you wrote for DEY about that work, which I love to share with everyone because there's this great image, that iceberg image that I love sharing that you did, that talks about how preschool focuses on surface skills, which look good when you start kindergarten, but it's the foundational skills, the bottom of the iceberg, that you tend to get from more resource parents, or kids get in a play-based kind of more hands-on environment, right? And those are the skills that are lacking. So we shared all those in the link. We'll add more as well too. And we're definitely going to come back because there's definitely questions about, well, what should public schools do, right? Like, what should we want? So I think this is where the issue comes up. We want access. We know that families need high quality early childhood. They need access. It needs to be offered. It needs to be free. It needs to be paid for by the state government or the federal government. But then expanding access brings up issues about location, space, where, right? And so let's just keep those in mind as we move forward and talk to Darielle about equity, right? Public schools are just one option. Not all public schools have to house preschool programs. Can they? Should they? I don't know. New York City, it was real easy. They don't have the space. They didn't have the space. They put them all in there. So they had to do mixed delivery, where they have early childhood programs delivering state-funded early childhood care still in those programs. And that means something for those facilities in the space. Not everywhere. It's not a perfect system. I don't know if there are any perfect systems, right? But that mixed delivery is one answer. But in states like California and other states where they're saying the expansion is happening in the public school, all of the money is directed to the public school, then you're funneling the expansion that way, and then there are issues around that, which is what Dale's blog and her research is showing us. There are issues around it. We can't put this all on public schools. Are public schools the best places to provide care for young children? Many are not, right? They're not designed. They're old buildings. They're not designed. There's a lot. So I just wanted to highlight that. But thank you so much for that, Dale. And we're going to keep the conversation going, and we're going to come back and talk more with everyone. But I want to bring in Darielle Blevins. So Darielle, we're talking about quality in relation to legislation and research. But one of the major aspects we must focus on is equity. When it comes to promoting equity in high quality early childhood education and care, what do we need to know? What are we missing? What are we getting right? What do you think? And especially in relation to what you just heard from Dale and from Amy.
I know, I'm like, we're already there, right? We already hit on it. So one of my first thoughts is, of course, what you were just saying, right? If we're putting most of our funding into public schools, then are we leaving out families and communities that actually prefer family child care, right? Or they prefer to have a family friend and neighbor care? What does it look like to have equitable funding or to put investment into what some communities prefer? But I do think one thing that often happens in these conversations is we don't have a shared understanding of what we mean when we're talking about equity, right? It becomes a buzzword. It becomes something that we just know we need to say, but we don't know what it looks like. We don't know what it looks like in practice. We don't know what it looks like in policy, right? We don't know what, and advocates don't always know like what to actually ask for, right? When we're talking about equity. And so I think it's useful to really think about equity as both a process, but also an outcome. Like, how do we get there? But also, what are we looking for? Right. So when we're thinking about equity, we can think about equity exists when things like access, right, or children's experiences and their outcomes, they're no longer associated with where a child lives, right? What we've brought up, right? Where they grow up, their zip code or their home language, right? Or just their style of language or their dialect. We have research now that you don't even have to be speaking a completely different language to experience bias. You can speak a different style of English, right? There's a study that talks about Black talk, right? Or a Black walk. If someone perceives that you're speaking in that way, it may garner some bias towards you, right? So thinking about how children's demographics and their identities are still being associated with negative outcomes, but also thinking about the process of equity, right? Like, how do we get there? How do we use this equity lens, especially on what we're talking about when we have new policies coming in? But we need to be asking questions like, who's at the table making decisions, right? Like Amy hit on that. Have you ever seen a child, right? Have you ever talked to a child? But also, do you have a shared experience with communities that aren't usually in positions of power, right? Or sometimes I say, I grew up as a little Black girl, so I'm like an expert on what I need, right? So as we have more of us at the table, it's easier to make policies that can meet the needs of communities of color or communities that have historically experienced discriminatory policies, right? Or practices. They can speak firsthand to what that means. And so, at the Children's Equity Project, we like to say equity is quality and quality is equity, right? That's aspirational. That's not what it is right now, but that's what we want. We want those to be linked. We want, when we're talking about quality, for us to be always having a conversation about equity. And so I can stop there or I can keep going.
Well, we definitely want you to keep going, but I want to invite everyone in for this part of the
Yes.
conversation too, the dialogue. We'd love to chat because I think it, like you said, that equity is quality, quality is equity, right? Like that's super important, and I think it just brings us back to everything that we're talking about. So we'd love to hear from the whole group about this issue around equity because it sounds to me, I think Dale, you're making this point so clearly, and someone said in the chat, well, why? Why are the places with higher income getting better facilities, right? And on one level, it's like because those parents would not allow anything less for their children.
Exactly.
Right? They have the social capital, the cultural capital, the financial, even if the money is given evenly. So what was that 2 point something billion California gave? Even if they doled it out to every district evenly, the parents in better position are able to advocate and resource for those funds, and they just wouldn't stand for something that wasn't what they want. They wouldn't send their kids there. It wouldn't be able to happen as opposed to the other families that Darielle's talking about who are left out of the decisions, who aren't brought to the table, who have no say. They have to take what they can get. And they're told to be grateful that they're getting anything at all, right? So that is an equity issue around quality. And I just love to hear other thoughts that you guys have about this issue as well.
Just a short reflection. I mean, the public education system has reflected obviously massive inequality always. Jonathan Kozol's book, Savage Inequalities, it was hard to read. The conditions of a lot of, inner city schools that he visited. And when you describe, these different situations in public schools, it just seems like an extension of what we already have now. The conditions, the plant and the access to the bathroom and all of the things that spill over from those issues then are just pushed down to pre-K. It's really.
So I had an interaction with a school administrator. I won't say where but in a city, and it was one of the ones we studied, and I presented the data to them. And in one of their schools, there were 625 behavior disapprovals across the day. We had counted them. And this administrator came up to me and she said, that doesn't surprise me. She said, that school is really difficult. And I said, well, why would you put a pre-K there? And she said, well, because the parents want it. And I thought, that things are going bad. And why wouldn't you fix the K8 or K4 system first before you try to put a pre-K in there? And it's just, then I'll let somebody else talk. But I was once asked if you had to think about elements of quality. To me, there are three. One, that a teacher respects children, which means you don't talk about children around them. You respect them so that you don't make them wait in line outside at a bathroom. There's many elements of respect. The second is that the teacher takes joy in children of that age. We are in classrooms where we code teacher tone. 70% of the time it's flat. We hardly ever see a smile. Third is that teachers treat children as a puzzle. So an intellectual puzzle. How are they learning? How can I help them learn? How is Denisha learning versus Nancy learning? And what difference can I make? What can I provide for one that I'm not? Anyway, three things. If you could do that, if you could implement those three things, and if the facility doesn't let you implement implement them, then don't put your class there. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful, those three things. And we're going to talk more about what are some aspects of quality. So if you're in the audience and you're thinking, please add in the chat, and add for my panelists and co-moderator, like also, what do we think are some of those aspects that really matter in high quality? Because that's one of the questions that we asked in the survey, and that we'll definitely share with you because I think it's important as well too.
You know, it's interesting if you think about teacher education and professional development. If you organize it around those 3 points, Dale, you could actually design a really effective and justice-oriented, hopefully equitable system by designing it around those 3 questions. It's really kind of a neat idea. But,
yeah. Definitely. And it just gives us a place to start. Like we don't have, often I don't think we just assume we all know what we're talking about. But if you don't develop that shared understanding, right, of what it is, like all of the philosophies and programs kind of have these shared tenets and goals, right? And it's important that we have those too, as we think about this idea of quality and equity as well too.
I also want to build on what Danielle shared about kind of people's perspectives and who's running for office, who are leading state agencies. And I think in Massachusetts, we have seen a shift of people who are running for office. And so I think people are coming in with more lived experience, either as a parent, trying to figure out their own, arrangements for their own young children, coming in with different like job experience. So maybe they ran a nonprofit, maybe they worked on issues around food security. So I think when common sense tells us when you have people with loved experience who are now making the laws and hearing from constituents, it does make a big difference. And so I think we've seen a shift in that. So I think the policies I think are getting better and more nuanced. Again, like with that screen of what belongs in policy. I've also been answering questions in the Q&A that's kind of got answered. So I just wanted to say, someone said, like, how do you build this relationship, especially around districts? And I think what we've seen here in Massachusetts is this local infrastructure piece is so important. We've spent, decades advocating at the state level for a universal pre-kindergarten system. We still don't have that as defined as most other states do in Massachusetts. But what we have seen are local level mayors, school committees, community-based organizations coming together to say, let's look at the landscape of like the data around how many children are there, what do families want to need, and then how are we going to best serve them. And we've seen mayors creating offices of early childhood, really thinking about what it looks like, to be a family-friendly city. So I think we have to take advantage of all of those pieces as well, that we're not just talking about what happens like in the walls of early ed programs, but how are we making learning visible? How are we making young children priorities in communities? Some of that, yes, is the programs that we're providing, but some of it is us, like how we talk about, what's it like to be a family? Are we talking about guaranteed family income? Are we thinking about greater access to high quality? If you think about, birth to 5, it's such a short period of time of life, and it's so critical. We just had Jack Shonkoff on the call, in the 9:30 call, and he talked about the Perry preschool study and said, there's not one more ounce of anything we can get from that study, right? But he also talked about like all the components that were funded as that intervention, and that we can't just take parts of it and say, we did all this, why are we not seeing the benefits? I also think we have to appreciate, March of 2020 and on. When you think about a pandemic, children were, the children now are, 4 years later, they're at all different stages of development, especially young children and families. So when you think about all that we've been through together as a society, we haven't really talked and acknowledged that. But the policies that are going to be created kind of in the next 5 years, I think are going to be a direct result of, as we're seeing some of the children kind of move through early elementary. And also when you think about the workforce, the educators, there's a lot of people getting closer to retirement age. And so what does that look, who is coming into this field? What do they believe about quality? And what's that going to look like in settings, across our communities?
So one of the inequities that Darielle, maybe you have looked at too is inequities in the workforce. So right
Right.
now, if places like North Carolina, places like Tennessee, California, they're paying those pre-K teachers. Well, in Tennessee, we pay them at parity with the K-12 system. So you get paid the same as a kindergarten teacher or a fifth grade teacher, whatever. But we know that the churn in childcare is outrageous. I mean, you can get more money from working at McDonald's, plus you might even get benefits. And that's an inequity we really should not allow to exist. I, it's so glaring, you would think that policies would try to address it.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is glaring. Go ahead, Darielle. I know you want to add to that.
Yeah. You're right. There's so many inequities in the ways that the workforce is paid, right? The point you hit on, like the differences in K-12 and preschool teachers, but also the inequities within, right, the early care system. Black teachers are often paid much less. I think there's a study that says 78 cents fewer per hour. Right. We also know that people of color, mostly women, we're talking mostly women of color, are concentrated, particularly immigrant women, right? They're concentrated in these assistant roles, right? We don't have a good pathway for folks who are coming in who have experience in child development. They maybe even have an education, but if they don't transfer into the ways that we view quality, then they're put in these assistant roles when they could be in leadership roles, right? So there's different ways and there's different inequities and levels of inequities.
Yeah, and I think it's important that it ties back to our founding and history of a country that's deeply racist, deeply classist, deeply sexist, right? And none of that has gone anywhere, and it just keeps being replicated, right? And so it's important that we call those out. And I see people in the chat doing that, right? And talking about how racism impacts our system, how people who don't end up liking children end up in childcare, and like like I'd rather you go flip those burgers than come over here and try and take care of our children, or how it's not about child development, it's about making money, it's about a business, right? And we've lost sight of the fact that childcare and development should be the goal, right? Caring for young children, whether their parents need to work or not, right? Like they should be in a safe space where they're being cared for by competent adults who understand child development, and providing that service to them as a right? It's something that every child deserves and needs. So this is great. I want to keep the conversation going, but I want to talk a little bit about the survey that we did. So to prepare for the Summer Institute, we did some quality research. We sent out a survey beginning April 1st through about May 6th. It ran, so it was about a month long that we did the survey, and then we also hosted some focus groups. And so we had about 200 people respond to the survey, and of those responses, 86 were early childhood practitioners. So we had a lot of parents and folks that were neither practitioner, neither parent, but maybe a former professor, researcher, advocate. But a lot of the responses I highlight come from the 86 early childhood practitioners. And then I was able to hold 3 focus groups with a total of 9 participants to kind of go deeper into the questions of quality. So first, I want to share a little bit with you about what they said about how do we define quality, because that was a general open-ended question that we posed to people, and I just wanted to share some of the responses, right? So, and I got to go through as a researcher, I got to go through and find the themes and all these, but I thought these were a good overview, right? So they talked about child and family centered, developmentally appropriate, play came up in almost every responses, right? And we have a lot of supportive play in our networks, which is a good thing. They talked about diverse families, training in their staff, being really important as well. Prioritizing care, right? I think that's a big issue around why we see the push for universal pre-K tied to public school. It's this mantra that I've heard President Biden and others say that we're talking about preschool, not care, not childcare or daycare. Or, first of all, we're not caring for days, we're caring for children. Let's call it what it is. It's early care and education, right? And I emphasize the 2 C's, right? Early childhood care and education, because a lot of people take out the care and they just want to talk about early childhood education. And I think we do a disservice when we forget that caring for children is the primary work in the early years of their development, that the care we give to them is just as important, if not more important, than the things we teach them down the line. We teach them through our care, right? And Carol Garber Murray, I hope you're watching, and I hope I'm doing your work justice, because she wrote the book Illuminating Care, and she talks about this super important. And I love her work, right? Care is education, and we need to get out of this false dichotomy, right? And so to hear people talk about how important we prioritize our care practices, we make children and families feel safe, we focus on social and emotional, trauma informed, right? Talking about relationships being super important. And so those are a few. We also had some other thoughts about quality that'll come up there, defining quality. Again, play comes up a lot, nurturing teachers, nature-based relationships, all of the things that we know are important. So now I'm going to ask the group here, so what would you include as really important, and from your perspective, what constitutes high quality early childhood education and care? Because everyone's talking about it, and it's super important that we just all share. And Dale, people have asked for you to expand on those 3 points, so we can put that out there now if you want to go back to those. I know I don't know if anyone caught them and wrote them down, but people are going to ask, well, what were those 3 again? We need to talk about them.
Well, maybe I'll do another blog.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
The first thing I think matters in quality is actually piggybacking on Dale's idea, which she said is teachers respect children. And to me, respect means knowing who they are. Who are they? Do you understand them and their development and their needs and their culture and their identities and their families? What is respect? I mean, respect is actually paying attention to another human being with an open mind and observing them and seeing what their needs are. And for teachers, I mean, child development has really taken short shrift in the last 20 years. And a lot of teachers who are trained aren't even getting a sufficient background in how children develop and what their needs are. And part of the reason we've ended up pushing these academics down and these expectations that are so out of line with who children are is the fact that we've lost that, grounding. And then the issue of children's culture and identities can't be separated from development, because who you are from the very moment you're born is integral to your life experience, your sense of who you are, your sense of who your family is. So for me, and respect for that, which, has to be really fleshed out. But to me, quality begins with this concept. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, so I am very concerned about the solution that some of my colleagues have put forward, which is that the solution to having a really high quality, that meaning a program that produces long-term academic effects, is that we need to have academically oriented, scripted curricula that pre-K teachers have to teach.
Yep.
And these scripted curricula, they happen whether children are, I've watched scripted curricula happen when kids are rolling around on the floor. I mean, but the teacher gets a check mark because they've actually kept up with what they're supposed to be doing that day. Nothing could be further from what we need for high quality. We need teachers who are really, really informed, and back to that intellectual puzzle part, who know things that they want to share with children. Somebody may get really upset with me, but when I had undergraduate advisees and they were going into early childhood, and I'd say, why? And they'd say, because I love children. I would say, great, go do something else and love children. That's terrific. What are you bringing to them? What are you bringing to them in terms of anything anything you need to share with them, ways you're going to help them understand the world and engage with the world and be interested in learning about nature and biology and math and all the things that you want to bring to children. And you need to love them in addition. That's great, care for them, but also there has to be some depth to your interactions with children, not scripted, but responsive to what children are interested in.
Well, the scripted curriculum, which is more and more widespread,
Yes.
doesn't allow for seeing who children are, for seeing their development, for seeing their individual needs, for seeing their culture, race, their gender identity. It doesn't allow for any of that because it's one size fits all, which is utterly alarming to me. I'm seeing it more and more. It's in all of those online pre-K programs. It's in many, many of the preschools. And, you know, we'll talk about it more on Wednesday, but 38 states have already legislated mandates about science of reading, which is a program we'll talk more about, but it's absolutely scripted, top-down, direct teaching, a technical approach to teaching reading, which to me, reading is language, and that's meaningful, and that reflects identity, culture, individuality, gender, you know, what we care about. We communicate with language, whether we talk or write, because we want to communicate with each other. That's the whole idea of it. To take that away from kids when we're first teaching them how to read just seems to me abusive.
So I collect a lot of very precise behavioral data in classrooms, which is where part of that blog came from. And one of the things we code is the amount of teacher talk. And teachers talk in these classrooms between 60 and 75% of the time. They listen to children about 9% of the time. There's no way that you can orient what you're doing in that classroom to children if you haven't heard them. If you don't listen to them, you don't know, what they think, what they care about. So those scripted curricula, right, encourage teachers just to talk and talk and talk and just assume that children are going to get it. But they don't know because they don't listen to them. So they have no idea whether they got it or didn't get it.
And I think it goes back to the lack of child development. How do you, I mean, if you understand, like on one end, we know so much about children, right? We know so much. There's so much research. Research that has held the test of time that I still tell my students about that was done a long time ago, because even though they've moved on and since died, those studies still hold the test. When other people redo that research, guess what? It's still there. We wouldn't keep talking about it if it didn't show back up in current studies, right? So, like, we have this long history. We know all these things, and not all the research is perfect, right? A lot of the research is biased because it was only done on white middle class children, right? It doesn't reflect other folks, right? But there's a ton of research out there. So we know about child development. But then when we get into practice, it's all of a sudden teachers don't know what they're doing. Teachers are the most educated people I know next to doctors, right? What other profession requires that amount of schooling and that level of education, even to be an assistant in the classroom? So much knowledge you have to take, courses you have to take, but then you're not allowed to use that knowledge to guide what you're doing because someone else is coming at you and saying, no, this is the script. Who wrote this script? Who knows anything about children and made this script, right? Why do we rely on script? Someone said in the comments, right? Some of us rely on creative curriculum because they're compensating, because we've been lowballed in the field. We don't feel like professionals. Now, look, I used to teach a class using the creative curriculum when it was just this book. It was this big book that had a really great way of like telling you how to set up the environment for children. It said, set up the block area, do this, set up the art area, it said all this great stuff, and that was it. And I used to use that, and I would teach it in all my preschool foundation classes. It was great. And then somewhere along the line, it turned into teaching strategies gold, and it turned into an assessment, and it turned into scripted curriculum, and it turned into a moneymaker, and it turned into not a tool to help teachers, but a forceful tool to tell teachers what to say and do. And that, it might not be used everywhere. I might be generalizing, right? But it's very much turned into a scripted thing. And I argue that teachers, that's even if you're not being compensated highly in the field, I understand that's a problem. But if you understand child development, you still don't need scripted materials. You need base knowledge in child development and the time and space to observe, talk, listen to children to make those decisions. If we can't trust you to make decisions about young children, then you shouldn't be in the classroom, right? The fact that we would rely on a script means we don't trust you, then why are you here? Why are you in this situation in the first place? And so I think there's a lot there, but I just wanted to say that because it's changed, right? It's changed. The nature of what we do with children has changed, so that something that was so simple like creative curriculum has for many people turned into something that's not great the way it's being used and mandate. New York City is forcing it upon every preschool program in the city. Which again has its challenges because a lot of them are doing other programs, right, that were more linguistically, culturally, racially supportive of the children in their environment.
I don't know how Amy wants to talk about how we can stop these policies, but I mean, California is going to adopt not just a curriculum that has to do with literacy, they're going to adopt a separate math curriculum. So these teachers are going to have, I mean, I was in some classrooms in Tennessee where they had a literacy curriculum, a math curriculum, a social emotional curriculum, a safe touch curriculum, and handwriting without tears. I mean, the teachers could barely turn around before they were trying to pull something else out to do. And it was so stressful for them and really not useful for children.
Right. I think as I kind of made the transition from preschool teacher, director to advocate, and then eventually lobbyist in Massachusetts because of our ethics laws, right? That was not a path I envisioned as a psychology early ed major in my undergrad. And I think one of my first meetings with a legislator, who was a friendly legislator, basically like asked me a question. And I just said, well, like, isn't that your job to figure it out? I didn't say it like that, but I had somebody with me who was more seasoned, said, I think what Amy's trying to say is, and kind of helped me through that situation. But that really has stayed with me. And so often I say, I'm so glad I don't work in government because I can't imagine being the person trying to make all of these decisions about policy when there are so many, like sometimes we're arguing against each other and ourselves about what we want. Like we want flexibility, but tell me what to do. This is what my program looks. I think, Dale, your point about liking kids, yes, and what else? What else? My controversial opinion for a while was that even though we have buckets of research, we still fundamentally in our mental models don't believe it when we look at young children, right? And so I think we still think, maybe we don't want to say it out loud, like, oh, well, we can fix that when they turn 5 and it's magic and we get to a public good paid for education. So I think part of it is the language that we use, right? Even the word academic, right? There's a lot of bells that go off for people, whether it's right. I remember when I was a director, I would have some parents say, like, well, when are they going to start real school? So when you think about people who are the front lines of welcoming children into kind of this education and care world, how are we thinking about all of those pieces? Because we also know families trust their early education providers. We saw that during COVID. We also had these incredible conversations living through the pandemic with superintendents, with people running programs, when they were doing the Monday, Wednesday, and then the Tuesday, Thursday, group 1 and group 2. And we would say, but everyone's going to the Y at the end of the day. So it doesn't, we couldn't apply like our common sense to like the way that we're trying to think about logistics and solve the problem. The one thing we've talked a ton about are coming up with solutions on the 9:30 call. Okay, this is the problem. What is the solution? Not we got to pay people more money, which is a solution, but how are we going to do that? If we only have X amount of money, how do we prioritize? So I think kind of having some of these tough conversations with ourselves, and not that everyone's going to have to agree. Another thing I've learned about the 9:30 call is about unfiltered advocacy. And as an early educator, I feel very personal when people are talking to elected and appointed officials. And I want us to be seen in the greatest light possible, of these incredible human beings. And sometimes when we're intimidated by the setting or we're mad or we're complaining, sometimes it can be hard to listen to that. And so I think when we talk about unfiltered advocacy and what that was during the pandemic, we had funders, we had policymakers, we had legislative staff listening in every day, hearing what was happening. And I got to tell you, it made a huge difference because sometimes as advocates, we try to, make it easy or even make it more complicated, or we're not sure. I think somebody said that earlier, like, we don't even know what we're asking for. What is the ask? So I think we have to take that seriously, and we have to be willing to think hard and think about, maybe we're not going to get everything that we want right now in this budget. But we also know that we need to lay the foundation. Maybe we have principles that we're like, whatever we do, we can't do any harm. It's got to be developmentally appropriate. And this is what that means, right? Because I think sometimes in the name of making standards, making things that we can measure, showing that things are working, we fall into our own trap of trying to prove it over and over. I have the opportunity to go to Reggio, and somebody on the tour asked, like, well, how do you know this is making a difference? And they called that the American question.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And they said, do you know what the Italian question is? Did you have a good day? Right? And I don't know if we're going to get there in my lifetime, but I think it's like often when you hear families say, like, I feel like my child's safe there, I feel like I can trust this person. Sometimes we need to really acknowledge and honor those pieces of quality of, I also knew a very serious researcher that after she had her first child, she called me from a parking lot and she said, oh my God, I'm thinking about convenience. When you think about the 5 pieces of quality, teacher-side interaction, ratio, all the things that we can count. But here, somebody who's so well-versed in the research said, but it can't be an hour from my house. And that didn't become real until I just had to go drive and visit the place. So I think, imagining what we all want for our own young children and families, and coming up with some of those solutions, and also admitting when we're like, wow, we thought that this policy or this decision was going to lead to this outcome, whether you can measure it or not, being willing to say, you know what, that didn't work. You have to reframe.
Right.
Times have changed. What children are dealing with has changed. What families are dealing with has changed. So what does that look like to adjust the policy in that? I also said, and it wasn't a flippant answer, about building relationships. And we always, of course, we're going to build a relationship. I mean, like, be the person, show up at the meeting. Hey, even if it's not about early ed, right? Just show up, get to know the people in your community who are making decisions. Often it's hard to find on the org chart. There's sometimes people that you'll never see in a structural leadership position, but they are the trusted people who policymakers listen to. So you want to be the go-to person in your community about what it could look like and what could be. So often we try to come up with solutions and give ourselves really tight parameters. Imagine what could be. What would it really look like if you could walk into a setting and see quality, and let's go for it.
I really love how you said that the difference between the question of Reggio, the American question, right? Our need to prove everything is working instead of just, what if our question was, what did we do today in the lives of children to give them a great day, right? It's right now. Like, we spend so much time in the preparation stage thinking early childhood is just preparation for the future that we lose track of, no, today is important in the life of a 3-year-old because it's today, and tomorrow is important in the life of a 5-year-old because it's that day, right? We need to focus on just today, right? And how important that is. So thank you for sharing that as well. Lots going on in the chat. We are going to transition to Q&A with the audience in about 15 minutes, so keep those questions coming. I also wanted to share with you a little bit more from the research. So an image is going to pop up, but this one was, I gave a list of factors about quality and education in early childhood education and care, and asked people to rank them. And so what I have for you in the image is the top 5 and the bottom 5. And then I'm going to, and then what I'm going to do is drop the whole list in the chat so people can see exactly what they had to choose from. And so there was some space for, for other things like that. So here's the entire list coming in. And then we're going to show you that image where it says top 5 and bottom 5. So teacher-child ratio. So the top 5 factors, 79 respondents, 92% said teacher-child ratio, teacher-staff knowledge of child development, commitment to play as expressed in the program philosophy and activities. Those were the top 3 rated. 79 out of 82 participants agreed, or sorry, 85 agreed that those were the top 3. Then the next ones that came in were commitment to social and emotional development, emphasis on natural environment movement, and inclusion of diverse children and families, right? So that rounded up our top 6, actually, of the factors. Again, 84 to 92% of participants. Oh yeah, the Zoom chat has a limit. Okay, I'll make sure you get the list of all of them. But those are the top 5. In the bottom 5, or sorry, top 6. The bottom 5 accredited by a national organization. Only 20% of people thought that that was important for high quality. Suspension and expulsion rates, which were interesting. Commitment to academic preparation. Only 10 people, 11.6% agreed that that was important for quality. And use of a commercial curriculum, i.e. creative curriculum, was also listed. The last one, only 4 people, 4.71% said that that was important factors, right? So as we're thinking about these factors, we just want to hear more from your thoughts about those as well too. And then also some of the concerns about quality. And so we have some responses as well. We asked open-ended question about the concerns that people have around quality. They talked about quality metrics tend to reflect white upper middle class values, right? And so that's one of the equity piece, right? Are we looking at what matters to folks who are not in this mythical norm? People talked about the need for freedom and exploration and play, too much screens and technology being forced in early childhood because a lot of these scripted programs require teachers be using technology all of the time. Other concerns, competitive wages came up on one of them as well. Again, screens, and then this idea that everything's based on a check mark and you can go around and make all these checks, but it doesn't mean that that's actually happening, right? And I think for me, that one was so interesting because I think the hardest thing about quality is then measuring it. If we know intuitively what high quality looks like, how do we measure it? And are those systems we have in place to measure it the best ways to measure it, right? We're thinking quantitative measures for something that's very qualitative, right? If quality is about relationships and observation and getting to know children and child development, how do you measure that? What works in that sense? So I'll open that up to you guys to think about some of your concerns around quality as well too. I think the question was, what do you believe is lacking in our current discussion and efforts to advance quality in early childhood education and care?
I can start. There were some great points about how we measure and what we're looking at. I recently wrote a report that was specifically about promoting Black joy in infant and early childhood mental health, right? And so I talked about joy as a state of being, but also an outcome, right? So that also goes to what we were saying before. What if what we were asking is, what if the goal is this child experienced joy today, right? And what does that look like? First, we all kind of have a visceral, warm feeling of what that means, but also it gives us different avenues of being able to see that, right? So even expanding as a researcher, I'm thinking there's so many ways for us to collect quote unquote data. That's not check marks, right? But a picture of a child laughing and jumping in a puddle would make me think that they experienced joy that day. Right? I do research in which we use visuals. So we ask parents to create vision boards, right? And pull out pictures, right? Often we ignore the visual and we focus on numbers. But even when we are thinking about numbers, right? Because there's different ways to quantify, are we asking the right questions? So many of our measures, right, are still looking at the average child's experience. And if we're focused on equity, then we'd actually want to know, what is each child experiencing and is it different? Right. And so right now we know the class is amazing. I've been trained on the class, right, as an observation tool, and it's not enough because there's no real measurement of if bias exists in that classroom. Right. Or there's no measurement of, is that teacher having those conversation loops only with girls, right? Or only with boys? So there are other tools that really need to be invited into the space, like the access, right? There's a tool called the access, and it really has a sensitivity to bias, to what are the experiences of, they call it racially minoritized students, right? What does it look like for an English language learner or a dual language learner, multi-language learner, right, in that classroom specifically? And so thinking about who has the power right now or who benefits, it's only a small amount of measures that are included in most either QRIS, right, or even NACE, right? And so I'm glad that a lot of states and other systems are doing that type of reflection, right? But when we think about quality, it's important for us to think specifically about how each child would experience it. And I will say I learned that most from my niece. So my niece is 8, and she is from Mexican heritage and also African American heritage. She spent a lot of time with both grandmas, her Mexican grandma, right, and her Black grandma. So she went to a public preschool, and she started asking, when she was playing in the kitchen, like, where's the cornbread? She started just drawing it, taking anything that was yellow. She was very much used to eating cornbread. That is what we eat on a Sunday dinner, right, at home. And so for her, she could not see herself represented in the dramatic play area, right? And we're talking about how important play is, but it's also important for children to see themselves even in those little spaces of play, right? As she got older, she's learning Spanish, she's learning English. She asks us, how come I don't have a Black Spanish teacher? Right? And so when we're thinking about the workforce, what does it look like to have a workforce that actually meets the needs of these students, right? There are Black people who speak lots of different languages, right? And what does that look like for children to be learning a language from someone who doesn't look like them? She has darker skin than some of the other children, and they would tell her, you can't speak Spanish because you're too dark. Right. And so we're also thinking about what are ways at school can we actively counter these biases that children are learning from somewhere. Right. So high quality really needs to be reflective of who children are. They need to be represented. They need to have materials that represent their home. Right. But then they also need to be in a space where they feel safe. She didn't want to go back to school. No one stood up for her. Her teacher didn't know how to respond. Right. So there's so many elements, even when we're talking about just what does that high quality look like?
I'm 100% behind everything you're saying, Darielle. And one of the things striking me is still we have this problem of not adequately preparing and training professionals, teachers to, to have a very serious experience in consciousness, anti-bias, discrimination, owning our own racism, our own pasts. If we're white, we have to be going through a process where we deconstruct what influenced us in order to be able to see the things that you're saying. And if a teacher can't see it, he or she can't do anything to make it a more just and amicable situation for every kid there.
And it's interesting because we've had anti-bias education in early childhood. We've had that book for so long, right?
Yeah.
But it still hasn't made its way and integrated into our teacher preparation, right? So the book is there, but there's no hands-on application of what does this look like. I think in the past, maybe 6 months, maybe year, I've been requested to do a presentation called Navigating Children's Bias, probably 6 times. Right? It's coming up more. When we're thinking about March 2020, it wasn't just the COVID-19 pandemic, but there was this awakening, right? But children were home and they were watching TV and they were seeing people being harmed, some people who look like them, some people who didn't. And they wondered what is happening. But it has meant that educators, they want to be able to respond, and they said, I don't know how, right? And so in what ways are we preparing them? But then that also leads me to faculty are saying, I don't know how to teach that, right? So we kind of have to step back and say, okay, we have to prepare our faculty to be able to teach our future teachers. How do you respond to this?
Yeah.
And states are legislating against it. In those states that say it's divisive to talk about race, what does that mean for anti-bias practices in early childhood? Are you telling me that we can't have a conversation with a 4-year-old when they say something? I don't want to hold my hand because your skin is dark. Dark girls can't be princesses. All the different comments we hear kids say. Are we not allowed to have a conversation with them about that? I had a simple conversation as like, why is your skin so dark? Well, I had to talk about a lot of things. I had to talk about melanin, right? I had to talk about a lot of things to this little boy to get him to understand. And that was cool, right? But like, if that conversation would have went sideways, right? Like if I have to get into a conversation about discrimination against people with dark skin. Is that not allowed in a state that is banned teaching this to young children? Like, anti-bias is supposed to be essential to what we do, but yet we're not having conversations about people trying to limit that in all aspects of our work. They don't want adults have to be trained on this. They don't want kids to have to hear about it. What kind of field are we setting up if we can't have these honest conversations with young children?
I want to just say on the heels of that I think one of the biggest impediments to quality is government interference. Not from a right-wing point of view, but rather from the time we saw No Child Left Behind, A Race to the Top, and Common Core, we saw more government overreach into education than we've had through our whole history. And it's just grown and grown and grown. Now to have legislate mandates that punish teachers for talking about race, racial justice, LGBT, gender identity issues. This is scary. And government mandating in 38 states what curriculum can be in literacy. I would like to back up for a second and ask, why are legislators mandating curriculum? Why? We have a field of educators with professional background and knowledge base. Why isn't it up to them to decide what their curriculum is? Why are they being told? What about all those scripted curricula that Dale's referring to in math and literacy and all these other things? Why is a teacher being told how to teach and what to teach? I'm sorry, but this to me is one of the most fundamental problems we have right now.
And I think it speaks to our vision of government intervention support and what their vision, right? So on the one hand, we have these people screaming, freedom, 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 keep the government out of our lives. But then we force the government to stop us from doing the things we want to do when we want to see the government provide that safety net. Don't let kids fall through the cracks. If a family can't afford this, the government should step in and provide it, right? So it's a different type, but we're getting the overreach of government and not the support of government, right? We need the support. We need the government to say, this is a policy initiative. This is something we want to see happen. Imagine if the funding is said, we want all early childhood teachers trained in racial identity development, trained in anti-bias, trained in culturally relevant, culturally sustaining practices. That's a type of government intervention that would be great. But instead, we're getting the flip side saying, you can't do this. You can't do that, even if you know it's what's best for children. And I know we're going to talk more on Wednesday because Nancy made a really good connection. If you haven't watched our DEY dialogue on science of reading, she made a really good connection that there is an overlap between banning children's literature and passing scripted reading curriculums, right? And we need people to understand how those things are connected. And we're going to get into a lot of that as well, too. So thank you for making that point. So I'm going to get ready, but I want to see if Dale or Amy or Darielle want to say anything before we get into our first question from the audience. Just about.
I think there's one thing we haven't talked about.
Yeah.
I mentioned it for the inequity in pay.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have a really good sense of what it would actually cost to run quality child care programs. We've been focused so much on pre-K. So on Wednesdays, I have a group I go hiking with, and we hike along the Eno River here. And every Wednesday, there's a group of about 6 or 8 4-year-olds, 4 and 5-year-olds, who are there all day. They backpack their lunches in. They were there with a couple of teachers, and well, when we encountered them, we didn't see an adult around. So it was a little alarming, but they were exploring. They had worms in their hands. They had rocks. They were up on trees, and I know that program cost those parents a good $20,000 a year.
Mm.
Huh.
And so if you want to really pay for and parents of means who are alarmed by the scriptedness and the rigidity, and especially parents of boys, of what's going on in pre-K and kindergarten, they are investing now in early care at a level that was unheard of a few years ago.
Yeah.
But the difference between that and, say, tomorrow's leaders down in a low-income area in terms of what they can pay and who can come. I mean, we've got a broken child care system, and we can't talk about. I don't want to focus just quality just on what happens in a pre-K classroom. I want to think about what's happening to children 0 to 5. And we have abandoned a discussion of how any policies. I don't see any policies in any states that are actually addressing child care and supporting families in that critical period, when their children are 0 to 5.
Yeah, I
could
think that's
say
a really good point. Go ahead, Amy.
in Massachusetts, we have one line item now that's 475 million that were those operational grants that started as federal money, right? So I think we have seen in Massachusetts, I think that's part of why we don't have a state funded pre-K program as defined by a lot of other places, is because we said we want it to be part of the whole system of childcare, early ed, Head Start,
Super.
right? So I think that makes it much harder to count. So if you're from near, we don't do well in the near yearbook, but it's because we never wanted to pick one lane of where young children were and invest in that. Jerry Robinson, who spent much of her life at the Boston Children's Museum, says we are the most over-researched and under-resourced part of education. But I think, sometimes perpetuate that. We don't ask if third grade is not working, then should we get rid of it or should we not fund it? We just have when it's a public good, we think of things differently. So I think, Nancy, to your question of why are there policies getting made? I think because on one hand, we're saying there's a crisis around early literacy. And when we come to the solution, that's what the policy solution is. I just put a link in the chat. We commissioned Noe Lisseau at Harvard University to do a report in 2010 about starting early literacy at birth. And everyone was like, yes, we should, except that no, we can fix it when they get to, it didn't go anywhere because it's hard to legislate good practice, right? Good educational practice. And so I think that's why I talk all the time about being solutions, because I have seen examples when we can come up with something, and it may be smaller examples, because I think some of this wide reaching policy is really hard to customize and to nuance. But so I think being part of the conversation from the beginning and showing the challenges that kind of a one size fit all policy makes and that's an exhausting job. and parts that other parts of education don't necessarily have to take on. But that's why I think the language that we use, the way that we talk about, the work that everyone's doing and what that looks like, and not to be I've also the word soft skills. I was like, gotta stop saying that. No one value, what are we really talking about here? So I think, again, checking ourselves on our own language and then thinking about how we are talking about this and then coming up with the solutions.
I appreciate that, because it is hard to legislate high quality. It's hard to legislate because you can't, I remember clearly studying legislative work in law school, right? And so one of the big things around special education and not disability access, right? The law gets passed and then it's out there, and then the judges start writing opinions based on the law, and then the lawmakers were like, wait, that's not what we wanted. That's not what we want. They realized the way the judges were interpreting the law was not, so they had to go back, but it took 10, 15 years. That's a long process to go back and then say, okay, let's change the law so the judges will get it right, right? And so that's a scary process, and you can put something out there, right? And then people start doing it wrong, and then you got to go through and change it again, right? So it's often better to say, put it out there very general and let people go ahead with the implementation of it in different ways, right? But then that creates a lot of issues as well too, right? People not doing, and that's okay. We do need that flexibility, but I always think that's important to remember, right? That there is a process, but it takes a long time to change. And once we finally get what we're asking for, then to have to go back and say, okay, but this isn't right. So how do we set it up from the beginning that it's being implemented equitable, that it's being implemented in different ways so that it can meet the needs of different people, instead of wanting, I think the more we want things standard for all, that one size fit all, the more danger we're in, because we'll soon learn that doesn't work for everyone. And that causes a lot of problems. All right, let's get into our Q&A. Dale, believe it or not, you got a lot of questions here. So I'm trying to sum them up, but I think the main question is because you started talking about California expansion, and then I know you said 2 districts you looked at in your blog around public schools and pre-K. So someone wants to know, well, what's the solution? What should public schools do? Because they can't make kids, I think it said pee on demand instead of making them line up in the it says what are solutions for schools not having an infrastructure for bathrooms? They cannot make children pee on demand. This is the issue in California, right? So I think the issue goes beyond that, but I'll let you start.
If I were making the policies, which
Yeah.
Amy, nobody's asking me to do that, I wouldn't put the
What's that?
classroom there. If it's not appropriate for them, I wouldn't put it there, period. I just wouldn't. There's,
Yeah.
so I don't know what's happening to it now, but about 10 or 15 years ago, Alabama, interestingly enough, had this marvelous woman whose name, of course, I won't remember right now. I wish I'd looked it up before we started, who really had the ear of the governor, and she started what's called Alabama's First Class Pre-K. And they rolled it out very slowly. They rolled it out just to a few districts. They got a lot of feedback about how it was working. They actually developed a whole manual about how these classrooms had to look. And then they sent observers out, and the ones that were furthest away from the meeting the criteria in the manual, those are the ones they sent coaches to. So they actually were very precise about where their coaches went. And it was in response to the fact that they were developing this manual of how to run this program. Anyway, they've moved it very slowly. And I don't know why California wanted to mandate that every district had to accept children in 2025, ready or not. And that's the mandate. But there's another model out there, which is Alabama, and I think Mississippi did the same thing, which is take it slow, be committed maybe to universal, if that's what you want, but move it out slowly so you get some feedback. Exactly as Amy said, is our policy working? If it's not doing what we want, it's small enough, we can still fix it.
Yeah, yeah, and that important. And I know it's hard because people want to rush into it, but rushing into it for young children, we can't repeat this year of their lives, right? As we rush into this, so yeah, if the public school can't handle the pre-K classroom because they don't have accessible bathrooms, they don't have doors to outside, then they don't get the preschool classroom. Where else in the community can we put those pre-K classrooms? Because we do want them in the community. Can we support already providers, right? I think we don't talk enough about how access to preschool is decimating the childcare industry because we're pushing pre-K 3 and 4 into public schools, and we're leaving private providers unable to remain open. So infant toddler care is probably non-existent in your state or your city. Look it up if you're unaware. Most states have a crisis around infant toddler care. Why? Because if you offer pre-K 3 and 4 in a public school, parents are going to, of course, take that option because who wants to pay for childcare for a 3-year-old when it can be a public school? Well, if you're a private provider, you can't just run an infant toddler program and make money. The ratios are way too high, right? Mostly they have to have a preschool program where the ratios are lower, where they bring in more students to make that money, and they're being pushed out. I saw this in Washington D.C. Every public school and charter school in Washington D.C. has a pre-K 3 and 4 classroom. Every public school and charter school, right? So when I would go to the centers where we would place our students and I'd go check on them, they're like, we won't be open next year. We can't compete because all of our 3-year-olds now go to the public school across the street. I said, well, what about your infant toddler class? And parents still need that. Yeah, but they're not getting it because we can't sustain ourselves, right? So why push into the public school if that's not mixed delivery, right? Different options. What if we invested in family childcare home providers, which we know are really essential for young children under the age of 2 or 3, being cared for by one person in a home with a small group of children is just as valuable as being in a center with 20 other infants and toddlers, right? And that should be up to the parents to decide what is best for their child, right? Some children want to be in the environment with the other 20 kids. You think that's best for them. Some of them, no, you want them in Miss Millie's home being cared by just for her and the other couple of children in her care. But are they going to get the same type of compensation, right, as the child care program as well too?
So in Michigan, Rolnick, who worked with the Federal Reserve Board there in Michigan, he had a whole program where, in fact, the funding went to the family as long as they picked a child care program that met certain criteria. And they could pick a program that was close to where they worked, if that was the most convenient. They could pick a program that was close to where they lived, if that was most convenient, a program that was close to grandma's house, if that was, in other words, parents had agency, they had flexibility, they could choose.
Yeah.
The opposition to this came from the teachers union,
Mm,
and it got shut down after a couple of years
Can you
Yeah.
say more about what the opposition was? I'm not making the connection.
because it didn't fund classrooms.
I see.
It didn't fund classrooms. It didn't fund teachers in classrooms. I've been in classrooms. So I don't get me started on this. This really drives me crazy. So Head Start, if you know, you have to stay. Head Start always over enrolls a couple of people because you have to stay right close to how many people you're mandated to have, right? So they have to over enroll because they're going to lose some people. But pre-K programs can start off with 20, and then you have parents who don't like the program who pull their kids out. And I've been in classrooms whereby February there are only 11 or 12 children left, but that teacher gets to stay there. and the assistant, nothing changes. The classroom is still there, even though they're now serving, 60% of the children they were mandated to serve.
Yeah, it does become a huge funding issue. And we've seen other aspects where, again, people like teachers unions navigating for what they want and what they need, often sometimes at ends, right? We've seen both sides of it. So I want to point out that when Chicago teachers went on their last strike, one of the things they were advocating for was more early childhood practices. They wanted more play. They wanted more support for their early childhood teachers, right? So they can be advocating for us, but then sometimes they've been working against us because it doesn't meet the needs of a public school. And if a public school needs teachers in the classroom, then that's what they're going to put forward, even if it comes at an expense, right, to another program as well too.
And with declining enrollment, which is happening all over, why not have pre-K programs? And your enrollment goes back up.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a huge issue. Our next question, and this one's it's a policy question. So it says, I'm interested in how the panelists see policy, especially funding, that applies pay equity for staff. Providing a livable wages and training funding for members of the community is rarely discussed. Hoping to hear more from these panelists about this. So any thoughts? I don't know, Amy, if you've had any work around that, or in your equity work, Darielle, too, if you know about this idea of pay equity and anyone doing anything good around pay equity and raising that in the field.
I'll just give a quick example because I said we should also celebrate bright spots. So Boston Public Schools tried to take that kind of the kind of argument that Dale just said about like, why would I pay for this program if I can go to this program at no cost to a parent? We often say free, but we know it's not free. It's no cost to the parent. Boston Public Schools came up with a model that includes supporting quality in community-based and family childcare. They've just welcomed in to figure out how to make it work there and in public schools. And they've come up with a funding mechanisms that support pay equity around now. And then to Dale's point, it's, we have to start somewhere. And you think about 3 and 4 year olds, I think that's why you have to think about across the spectrum. Again, but this is another place that when we talk about quality, we talk about it's so much money, we talk about we have to pay, and then nothing happens. So what are incremental steps to get there? How do you think about, the other discussion we've had always around quality is, do you need a degree or not? And there's a lot of feelings and research about this on both sides, and thinking about what we're really trying to do for young children. So I think pay equity has to be part of the conversation, but not just pay, compensation, benefits, hours worked, working conditions. The folks at Berkeley are doing so much around looking at this holistically and not just about a paycheck, because often if you get maybe the same salary, then we'll hear, well, we're open 180 days and we're open 260 days. So really how we define equity and what are we doing here? Like, what are we trying to do? I think sometimes we get so wrapped up in that we forget, like, wait, we're trying to get the best places for children to go and to support the people that are doing it. And I think the pitting early the community-based and the public schools against each other is a really tough trap to fall in. And it's about how are we taking the best parts of both of those systems and trying to spread that across, instead of, because I think we've had that kind of circular conversation for so many years. So I really look at places like Boston that's trying to take on these really tough issues and think about what the implementation practices are. And I think, Jason Sachs, who built that program, quality was non-negotiable. we often see that when something gets too expensive, well, can we just cut back? Can we stop regulating this so much? Can we just change some of the rules? And I think we gotta flip that and say, nope, this is what we're expecting, and we're gonna have to support what it's gonna take to get there.
I just want to piggyback on that for a minute. I totally support that. Boston Public Schools, I think, has been, they have a whole early childhood department. It's a big urban system. And it's the best model I know in the whole country. I keep telling people that. And trying to stay connected to the system that's in place in the community for childcare at the same time that they're bringing in younger children into public schools, and being really inclusive about that, and honoring the childcare workers who've done family daycare or, you know, small centers in a community, whatever, and not wanting to put them out of business, and trying to include them. And also sometimes and not requiring them to get a certain degree or a master's degree or something, but maybe offering coaching. And they have a terrific coaching system in early childhood Boston Public Schools. It's a fantastic system, actually. So I do think it's a model there for other states to look at, to learn about and look at, because it's offering a lot of the elements that we're talking about in terms of ramping up an early childhood system that is inclusive in the community. Yeah.
I would just add learning and pivoting and moving and changing, not just saying this is the way we're going to do it. There have been many iterations, and it was also the painfully honest feedback they were getting from people who were willing to partner and work through this stuff instead of walk away and say, I'm done.
Yeah, I will also mention New York City around the pay equity. I was preparing students at Sarah Lawrence College, and the DOE was putting on a webinar for new teachers, and so we all went as part of my class, and I was interested to hear what they were doing. So as you mentioned, expansion for universal pre-K happened outside of public schools in New York City, mainly because of a space issue. Co-location is a real thing where you have like 3 schools in one building, because that's how tight the real estate is here, right? So a lot of private centers and nonprofits are part of the universal child care expansion. What that means, if you're graduating and you're going to get a degree to teach, a license to teach early childhood, the pay equity means you can work in a private center that's universal pre-K access and receive the same salary you would get as a kindergarten teacher in a public school. And that matters, right? I remember when I was coming out of my degree program, I got offered a job at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., had a preschool that I was researching because of the Reggio Emilia approach, and I wanted to work there. And the pay and the hours made it impossible because I couldn't even keep my part-time waitressing job. But my public school, the DC public school kindergarten, was offering more money as a kindergarten teacher and less hours, right? So that I could also keep my waitressing job because I still needed it, right? And so that issue becomes really important, right? If you can't go work in a private place, a private preschool area, because the funding's different, that's one thing that states can do. Pay teachers the same amount of money to go teach a 3-year-old in a private preschool that you would a public school kindergarten teacher. And yeah, then we get into issues of like, well, who's teaching more and who's working more. And I think that's where we get into such harm for ourselves. I've heard people say, well, they're just babysitters. They don't deserve. Like, we need teachers and educators to stop thinking that what we do with 5 and 6-year-olds is more important or better than what we do with 2 and 3-year-olds. Changing diapers is just as important as teaching letter sounds, right? And so if you don't want to do that work, that's fine, but we shouldn't devalue the work that other people are doing and feel threatened that they're being paid the same amount, right? We get into these issues of I work. We want clout. We want to feel like we are special. We work in a public school. But I want my child care providers to feel just as special. They're at home caring for children in the most important years of their development. How can we bring them all along? I'm sorry, I'll get off that soapbox, but I wanted to mention that as well too. Our next question, which I thought was really interesting, because you brought this up, Amy, about the research. We know it's out there. So this person said, how often do these studies result in changes at a system level or any changes in professional development? My district has been involved in studies, and we see the summary brief, but it rarely turns around into PD focused in any of the findings. And so this is something close to my heart. You know, DEY, we're launching research into practice, professional learning. I'm trying my best to make sure that the research that we know, that we read, that we conduct is getting into the hands of the people who need it the most. You know, we did a book study last year on segregation by experience. I think that book is so fundamental for early childhood teachers to understand the power of agency and how that doesn't show up in children's lives based on their race and class, right? And so, how do we get that information out there? And so, I think it's super important. But I agree, as I tell my students, we know, we have the research, we know, but rarely is it getting into practice. So, what are your thoughts? And especially Dale, I tell people all the time, there is a study out there that says academic school has worse outcomes for children in third grade and sixth grade. And they look at me like I've lost my mind. And I just drop the link to your study and I'm like, read it. It's here. Like, people don't want to believe that this stuff is actually out there. And I think it's super important that we share it with them. So, any thoughts on that?
Well, then Amy really and Darielle should speak to this, but I actually sadly came to the conclusion that policies are based on values and beliefs. And whatever the current beliefs are, that's policy. What would be really great would be if they would use research to confirm whether the policy is creating what the outcomes that they want, but they don't. Because once they've adopted the policy, they only seek research that is confirmative, not research that would make them revisit the policy and rethink what to do. And I think that's what happens. Is why we don't appear to see research influencing policy, because policy is influenced by people's predetermined beliefs, and they really are. It's been very hard for people to, just as you said, to accept the results from our study. And now there are 3 other randomized controlled trials. They haven't followed their kids as long as ours, but they're showing exactly the same thing.
Well, there are also the pressures from the tech companies to promote, online learning at earlier ages. There's the pressures from the publishers who are making millions of dollars every time you legislate a new curriculum, and these publishers are thrilled about it. They don't care what it is. They'll make it and sell it and make huge profits from it. And this is unnecessary money, because it could be going directly to schools if teachers could just be able to teach the literacy curriculum or any other curriculum they want without this published stuff getting promoted to millions of schools. But there's pressures on the legislative process. It's not an honest process. And it is, I agree with you, it's values and predetermined ideas, but they're also in a context of a consumer culture.
I think at the Children's Equity Project, which was founded by Chantel Meek, she's very passionate about ensuring that she's making relationships with the people who are in government who have aligned ideals, right? It's not all people who don't want to listen, but she also says that we have to make their jobs easier, right? So when we do a study, we then put out a report that says exactly, this is what the research says, this is the data, but this is what this means. And we even wrote down a suggestion that you could almost copy and paste into a policy, right? So make it incredibly easy so that there's no barrier, right? So we have several reports, right? Like the 14 priorities for dismantling racism. And it's broken down. This is what Congress can do. This is what states can do. This is what a federal agency can do, all research-based, right? So that when that one advocate who is in government at that point, they're having a conversation, they have data behind them, they have a suggestion, right? So I do think that there's a role for these in-between policy centers, right? Like the Children's Equity Project, to really play a role in bridging the gap in research. Because, when you're getting your PhD or when you're doing research, you're told that scholarly research is the most important or the most valued. And that's not what policymakers are reading, right? They need someone to digest it for them and tell them, this is what this means in policy. And so I think that's also what we need for practice, right? A new study comes out, it has implications for a teacher. Someone needs to bridge that gap. But what does that mean for faculty? We don't even talk about chairs of departments. What does that mean if you're at a university and a new study comes out? What does that mean for your next semester?
Darielle, I'm
That's
gonna
such a
have you
great
come do
point.
that presentation for me. or that presentation is what, because I think that's exactly right. Bridging the gap. We have been working on a letter to the conference committee, who's just, writing the state budget right now, and there's $115 million at stake, but there's a lot of policy at stake. And you can see what their intentions are by their proposals. We were writing our letter and we said, with all the technicalities, and we said out loud, let's write a paragraph that says, this is what we want in just very plain speak. And then let's go back and try to assign it and say, this does that here, this does that there. Sometimes we can lose our way. We're trying to either take what we want and put it in legislative ease or the other way. And I think the unintended consequences of not understanding every nuance of our system is huge. And that's why I think, we all say like, oh, another pilot program, oh, another thing. Well, if we can figure it out in a way that doesn't kind of, commit us for the all eternity for the way things have to be, I think it's a good option. We passed a bill and that Governor Patrick signed in 2008 that there shall be universal pre-kindergarten access in Massachusetts, and it's subject to appropriation. Those words mean a lot. So the policy was all there, but the funding wasn't there. Even if, you often hear advocates say, even if we had a $1 gajillion, we would not know how to get it out in a way, and that's on us. So we have to stop waiting for the money and start really thinking about those plans that we would use to get it out.
That's such a good point, Amy, because it takes a long time. I remember working on a legislative project in DC in law school, and we passed it. And then it took 4 years to get it funded because it required a change in the tax code. We were asking them to eliminate a tax. Well, guess what? Where are they going to pull that $1 million from? That took 4 years to figure out. Like, they're not just going to give up the $1 million. It got to come from somewhere, right? And so it takes a long time, right? And so last year we had someone on from New Mexico talking about how New Mexico, after 10 years of trying, finally got a constitutional amendment that could put money, lots of money, a good small percentage of a fund into early childhood education and care. That was huge, but it took 10 years, right? And it took being told no, being given a little, but not that, and coming back and asking again. It took coalitions, right? It took a lot of things. So we hope that that's the kind of work that it takes, and we hope everyone here has shed a little light on that. It's not easy. It's not going to happen overnight, right? But it's important and it's worthwhile. And it's almost 6 o'clock, so I'm going to bring us to a close. I just want to thank you all so much. I know we didn't get to all the questions in the Q&A, and we will try and respond to some in the resources that we're going to send out. Yes, we know the chat has lots of links and stuff. Zoe and Alden are doing an amazing job tracking all of that. You're going to get a nice email tomorrow, and it's going to highlight all of the links we already shared with you, new ones from today. As soon as our team at Zero Studios has had a chance to process all the videos, we will share those probably next week. We'll get them up on our YouTube page as well. But first I want to thank my co-moderator, my fabulous, I call her my boss to my kids. I'm like, that's my boss, right? But really my colleague and my friend, Nancy Carlson Page, who really has allowed me to come into defending the early years and do what I dream of doing, which is talking about early childhood education and care to the people that matter, right? About the things that matter. So thank you so much. I want to thank Amy O'Leary. This is the second time we've gotten to chat, and it's always great. And I just hope we can continue to do more. Dale, we love having you there. Your blog was right on time. If you want to publish a special report with DEY on your research, we will publish that for you. We're not peer reviewed, but I don't think you need peer reviewed publications at this point in your life. You're fine to just publish, so let us know. And Darielle, welcome to the DEY team. We loved having you. We loved hearing about the work. We're going to have to get you on with Chantel and Ihoma to talk more about equity in this work. We'd love to continue the conversation. To everyone else, thank you so much. Please join us tomorrow for day 2, where we're talking more about policy. I mean, we can't get out of the work on policy, but we have 3 Bank Street Early Childhood Policy Fellows to really make the connection between quality in terms of policy and practice. We'll be sharing more from our research, and we'll be talking more about what you have to look forward to, including our Reflective Practice series and some webinars that we have upcoming. So stay tuned. Thank you so much, and we'll see you tomorrow at 4 p.m.